Welcome, everyone, to our first public seminar in a new course I'm teaching on political participation, a research dialogue with leading international scholars. My name is Jenny Oser, and I'm an associate professor of politics and government at Ben-Gurion University. I'm also the principal investigator of an ERC project on participation and representation in the digital age. And I'm very honored to introduce our first speaker in this series, Professor Michael Delli Carpini of the University of Pennsylvania. Michael is a leading researcher on the role of citizens in democratic politics, with an emphasis on the impact of digital media on public opinion, public deliberation, and political participation. Michael's talk today is on the topic of digital media and democratic futures, which is also the title of an introductory chapter of a 2019 book that he edited on this topic. Before turning to Michael's talk, a few notes on how we'll run this webinar. First, Michael will speak for about a half hour. Second, I'll introduce panelists who've carefully read the introductory chapter of Michael's book and have each prepared questions in advance. And third, we'll select questions that participants write to us in the chat for Michael's response. So during Michael's talk, we welcome you to add your questions into the chat for the panelists' review. Thank you all for joining us. And Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jenny, and thank you for inviting me to do this. And for those of you who are attending, I appreciate that. I'm very excited about your larger project of which this class is a part, so I'm looking forward to what comes out of it. And I'm looking forward to the Q&A. So I know that at least the students in the class have read the introduction to the edited volume that Jenny mentioned, Digital Media and Democratic Futures. And what I want to do in the 25 or 30 minutes that I have is put that reading into a little bit of context by talking about how it fits into the larger body of work that I've done on democratic citizenship and the role of digital media and other forms of ICTs in democratic practice. In thinking about this talk, I realized or kind of came to the conclusion that while I've worked in a number of different areas, that what ties my work together is interest in the structural, the group, and the individual factors that work to enhance or inhibit meaningful, and it's important to focus on meaningful citizen engagement in politics. And so I've looked at generational differences in political engagement. I've looked at the issue of political knowledge and the role it plays in meaningful participation. I've looked at the role of political talk and deliberation. And most relevant to today's talk, the role that the changing information environment plays on how democratic practice plays out in different polities, although most of my work focuses on the United States. So to put that chapter in context, I want to talk a little bit about the book that I wrote about 10 or 12 years ago with Bruce Williams called After Broadcast News, because that book, I think, lays the groundwork for the way I had and continue to think about the role of media generally and digital media in particular on citizen engagement and democratic practice. So the argument of that book, and I will bring that back at the end of the time that I have to the chapter that the students read in the class. So the basic argument in the book that Bruce and I wrote starts with the premise that, the obvious premise in some ways, that there are many, many different forms of democracy. And those forms vary across polities, obviously, but they also vary across time. And in the case of the United States, the expected relationship in democracy between citizens, political elites, and the media is shaped by both the notion of democracy that is dominant at that time, but also on a variety of other factors: economic factors, political factors, cultural factors, and technology. And that's what we focus on primarily in the book. We argue that the result of that interplay between political elites, citizens, and the information environment or the media is what we call media regimes. And by media regimes, what we mean is historically specific, relatively stable set of institutions, norms, processes, and actors that shape the expectation and practices of media producers and media consumers. So basically, a media regime, in the way that we argue, is the way in which the media and the way it's structured influences the interplay between political elites, citizens, and the media itself. So what we argue in that book is that as economics in a political system like the United States, as politics, as culture, and especially for the purposes of this talk, as technology change, those rules within a particular regime, how citizens are expected to behave, what they're supposed to attend to, what their role is in society, how they interact with political elites, those behaviors change before the rules change. And so there's a disconnect, and we call these periods of disjuncture, political disjuncture, in which people are behaving, media is behaving, elites are behaving in a way that isn't the normal way that those actors behave under a particular regime, because there's all this change going on. But we haven't developed as a society, as a culture, as a polity, haven't developed new rules. A new regime hasn't come into place. And so there's a bit of chaos that goes on in those periods. And what we argue at the time, the reason we wrote this book, and what we argue at the time that we wrote it, was that the regime that was in place in the United States, which we call, not originally, what we call the age of broadcast news, which dominated the second half of the 20th century in the United States, and that had characteristics like professional journalists who were the ones who were supposed to inform us, very specifically defined media that was meant to be the political media, the civic media, like news at 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock, or other public affairs media that was walled off and broadcast at the same time across the United States. Mass audiences, because electronic media, broadcast media could reach huge numbers of people, all listening to basically the same political information, and a relatively limited citizen role dominated by the notion of paying attention to the news and voting. Those norms and procedures that defined that period, because of the nature of broadcast news and its technological affordances, beginning in the late 20th century, that began to break down, driven by technological change, which is what I'm going to talk about, but also driven by economic change, like the dominance of neoliberalism after the fall of the Soviet Union, political change that included the end of the Cold War and the move towards globalism, cultural change like identity politics, and so on. So there was a period around the time we were writing, but beginning before that, in which everyone was wondering what's going on in democratic politics in the United States, but also what's going on in terms of technology and the role of the media and what media looks like. Now, when we were writing, as I said, a new regime, a new set of rules, a new understanding of the relationship between citizens, elites, and the media had not developed, but there were certain characteristics of what was emerging that we thought were going to be important as this change evolved and as we began to sort out what politics and media were going to look like in the United States. And those characteristics, which are pretty common now, but which we feel like we began to identify pretty early on, were the blurring of fact and opinion, the blurring of entertainment and news, the blurring of news producers and news consumers, and the blurring of interpersonal and mass communication. We thought those were the four characteristics that appeared to be dominant in this new environment that we were living in, that were going to be important to the role of the media and digital media in particular, although this really started much earlier with even the rise of cable TV. You could even point to the rise of the remote control as beginning to develop this, but it was really the computer, the internet, digital and social media that were driving the fast-paced change that was taking place. We further argue that the result of these changes was the beginnings of a political environment that was characterized, and we borrow this from political theorists, these concepts, hyperreality and multi-axiality. And what we meant and mean by hyperreality is that the mediated representation of political events and political views mattered more than the underlying facts of those events. That is, that it was, as we increasingly lived in a mediated world, it was the way that media represented things that mattered more than what we understood, what was happening on the ground. And the multi-axiality, what we meant by that is that this new environment, which was very decentralized compared to what we had prior to it, meant that power could reside in a wider range of actors than was the case during the latter half of the 20th century, that you could capture the media soapbox and therefore capture the attention of the public and therefore capture the political agenda from parts of the globe, parts of the United States, groups in the United States that did not have as much political power or potential political power in earlier periods. Now, what we argue, which also comes across in the chapter that some of you read, is that these changes are neither inherently good nor inherently bad. What we were reacting to when we wrote the book was a sense of people that either this new, more small d democratic media environment was just an absolutely positive thing, or that it was problematic and we need to go back to the more natural, with natural in quotes, media environment that we had that dominated the mid to later part of the 20th century. And our argument was that, number one, there's no going back, but number two, that the affordances of any mediated environment, of any media regime, have both democratic and anti-democratic potential. In fact, I've come to believe that the greater the democratic potential of any information and communication technology is equally matched by a greater anti-democratic potential. That by the very nature of the way technology works, if it has democratic potential, it has an equal part of anti-democratic potential and therefore requires political will. And the outcome and its benefits or its problematic nature depends entirely on how we use it, how it's designed, how we understand it, how it's used by elites, how it's used by citizens, and how it's used by the media itself. So this left us with the question, what would a new media regime look like if it emerged? Would a new media regime emerge? And what would its characteristics be? And as I said, this is there's nothing, technology is important, but it's not deterministic. That this is a political decision that needed to be made by, in the case of what we were looking at, the United States, made by our citizenry, made by the media itself, and made by political elites of various kinds, because elites had expanded in this new environment that we have. And what we tried to say is, well, what would we look for? And this is more normative now, but what would we look for if we wanted the affordances of this new technology to be democratically valuable? And so we argue that politically relevant media is media that shapes the opportunities for understanding, deliberating about, and acting on the conditions of one's everyday life, the lives of fellow community members, and the norms and structures of power that shape these relationships. So that's a pretty broad definition, but we wanted it to be broad both because we wanted to be able to say that politically relevant media is more than just the news in this new environment. It's always been true, but it's more especially true in this new environment. Um, and that what it means to be to enhance democracy or detract from democracy is its ability to inhibit or to support democratic understanding and democratic deliberation among citizens. And they need to have that understanding if democracy is going to work the way it's supposed to. So a lot has happened since we wrote that book. And what I want to do now is talk a little bit about where my views are. I can't speak for Bruce, but where my views are on what we got right, what we didn't understand, what is going on now. The first thing I want to say is that we do think that the qualities of this new environment and the implications of this new environment have not only held up over time, but have been more extreme than we even anticipated. And I think in the United States, I think Donald Trump is an example of that. The rise of Trump, the rise of Trumpism, the rise of the new right, the conservative right, whatever term you want to use, the extreme right, whatever term you want to use for it, I think really captures what we were describing in the book. If you think about the four qualities that we mentioned, and think about the way in which Donald Trump has been able to capture the imagination of a significant segment of the American public, enough so to win the presidential election and to almost certainly be the nominee in 2024. The blurring of news, of fact and opinion, the blurring of news and entertainment. Donald Trump is nothing if he's not entertaining. And I think you can see that regardless of your political views. The blurring of both interpersonal and mass-mediated communication, and the blurring of news producers and news consumers is very much the information environment that we live in that has led to both hyperreality, that is, the mediated representation of events becomes more, and I'm overstating this, but more important than the events itself. Think about the notion of, was the election of 2020 stolen? That debate in the United States takes place less driven by facts and much more driven by the media that you consume and the way that it is described and the narratives that emerge from them. And multi-axiality. You have to remember that Donald Trump was not the choice of the Republican Party in 2016 in terms of the Republican Party elites. That Donald Trump captured Republican Party by understanding more than most of us did the ways in which you could manipulate the current system to no longer be tethered to facts, to no longer be tethered to traditional news outlets, to no longer be tethered to traditional journalists, to use culture as a form of politics and political engagement. And so, the darker side, if you will, of the new environment and what it might look like emerged pretty clearly during this period. But I also think that there were things that we did not fully understand and that as time has passed need greater thought. And so I want to talk a little bit about that and talk about how that fits into the short chapter that you read and the larger volume, which some of you may have looked at some of those chapters, some of you may not have. So one of the things is whether a new media regime will in fact emerge. And this is one of the critiques we got when we first published the book, is our assumption that because in the past eras in the United States, and we identify 4 or 5 of them, that eventually things settle down and new set of procedures and rules and processes of how citizens should behave in a democratic society emerge and what the role of the media was. You could argue that may not happen in this new environment, that it is such a decentralized, such a chaotic, such a market-driven as opposed to politically driven system, that you're not going to get anything that looks like a stable system. And that's a possibility, and I think that the jury's still out on that and needs some thinking on that. But more specifically, one of the things that I've come to think is that, first of all, consistent with what we argue, but not with the way we played it out, is that it's important to understand that if this is all context dependent, both on technology, but also on politics and culture and economics, that to understand the role of digital media, we need to expand the media regimes or the polities that we focus on. So it became clear to me that looking at the and this is an obvious point again, but looking at the United States, which is what my focus and Bruce and I's focus has been, I mean, that's a limited way of understanding the way in which media technology, digital media can influence democratic practice in good and in bad ways. So number one, there needs to be a much more expansive look at how digital technology plays out in its relationship to politics generally and democratic politics more specifically across nations, which is one of the reasons why I'm very excited about the project that Jenny is leading. Secondly, again, consistent with what we argued, but that we didn't fully appreciate the implications of it, is that when we talk about the implications for democracy, we need to think about democracies. That because there are such various forms of democracy, the relationship of digital media to democratic practice in different polities is going to be different. And again, to understand what the role of digital technology is, you need to look at the way it plays out and the role that it plays in small and big ways across more than just United States, more than just Western democracies, more than just democracies, which I'll talk about in a second. Third is my realization that there's a difference between talking, since I'm so interested in deliberative forms of democracy, and so interested, even if it's not a deliberative democracy, interested in the role that talk among citizens and citizens to elites play in politics. There's a difference between talking about deliberative democracies and talking about democratic deliberation. And what I mean by that is that you can have acts and forms and structures of democratic deliberation that take place in systems that otherwise are not deliberative and otherwise are not necessarily even democratic. So that as digital technologies spread and are used in different kinds of ways, they can play a role in democratic deliberation, even in societies in which the idea of democratic deliberation is not embedded or built in. That can be grains or seeds that can lead to more democracy, or they can be isolated events, but it is a complicated, context-dependent relationship. And then lastly, and most connected to the chapter that you read, the book that Bruce and I wrote is very much at the meta level. It does very quick and sweeping historical analyses of 250 years of American history. It talks at a very high level about the role of digital technology, both in the past and the present, and what we think it might be like in the future. But to really get at this as a set of disciplines, it's really important to focus at the more meso and especially the more micro level, because the way there is so many path-dependent and contingent aspects and context-dependent aspects of how digital media is designed, is implemented, is accessed rather, and is used in both intended and unintended ways, that to understand it requires really looking at case studies, looking at micro level, looking at that in a comparative way, given what I said, looking at it in different forms of democracy and different forms of polities, and in very carefully designed case study approaches. So the edited volume that you all, or some of you read, was a small effort, a beginning effort to try to do that. So it's certainly not comprehensive in the countries or the case studies that were used. I acknowledge that right off the base at the start. It was based, just so you know, although I think I mentioned this in the introduction, on a series of workshops that took place at the University of Pennsylvania, and I think around 2017, where scholars from across the country and across the globe who had been doing research on digital media and democratic practice presented case studies of some of them more meta level, quantitative and qualitative, both democratic and non-democratic regimes, about how digital media is infusing itself in the politics of those nations and what the implications are both for democratic practice and for political practice more generally. And the themes that emerged from this series of papers, which were really not organized in a specific way during the workshops, was that there were four emergent themes that allowed me to put some of those papers in the organization of the book that the chapter came from. Number one is the importance of the design of technology and how right from the start, right from the thinking about how one designs and implements digital media and information and communication technologies more broadly, plays a significant role in whether it is going to have any role in democratic practice, and if it has a role, whether it will be enhancing or inhibiting, and to whom it will be enhancing and inhibiting. So that the obvious point again is that if you want technology to play a valuable, useful role in democratic politics, at one level, that needs to be thought through right from its inception. Secondly is the role of expertise, because in the chaotic social media-led digital media environment that we live in, expertise can be lost sometimes. And who it is that gets to speak to issues of politics and how they speak to it and what their role is in shaping what others think. Right now, who has that soapbox, who has that power, feels like it moves among very different groups, some of whom are more in the margins, some of whom are more in the but one of the things that came through on these chapters is that expertise, both political expertise and technological expertise, is still really crucial, and in some ways more crucial than ever. That was the second emergent theme of the various papers that were part of this workshop. The third is the way in which this new environment, and it's a little bit in conflict with the idea of expertise, is that, or maybe not in conflict, but a different notion of expertise, is that digital media can, in the right circumstances, give the public, give citizens great power and great ability to engage in politics in ways that they did not have in the past. And some of that can be through using digital media in ways for which it was not originally intended. So there are ways to appropriate even media, digital technology and media that is not intended to be used for digital, for political purpose or democratic purposes. And then the fourth emergent theme, which is consistent in some ways with our notion of media regimes, is that none of this happens and none of it can happen in a good or a bad way without thinking about the overarching political regulation of various forms of digital media. And what does that regulation look like? What is appropriate and not appropriate? What are the unintended consequences of regulation? Where should the line be between allowing the free flow of information versus channeling it through media that's and technology that's designed to enhance the democratic capabilities of the media? So those were the four emergent themes that are in the book that I talk about in the chapter that some of you read, and that I think are avenues for future research and practice to be thought about as we continue to think about the role of digital media in democratic practice. So where does this leave us? And I'll end on these points. number one, I have to admit that that while in the book, I would say that our overarching view, Bruce and I's, was more optimistic, that we saw the democratic potential of the new information environment as outweighing, if we did it right, the non-democratic. And we also think that while we lose a lot from the era that preceded it, there was a lot about the era that preceded it that was really problematic in its overly centralized nature. But I have to admit that it's hard to maintain that optimism as you look at the state of the current world and the role that social media in particular has played, and how the four blurrings that I mentioned have played out in more negative than potentially positive ways. But I also think it's important not to get too captured by that view. I remind myself that I am both a student of this topic, but I also live in this digital environment. And the fact of the matter is that the focus more broadly is on these negative consequences. And we sometimes miss, which is why I think the book, the edited volume, is important. We sometimes miss all the work that's going on using digital media that is potentially very positive. And for every positive example, for every negative example of how digital media played a anti-democratic role, you can pull out a positive example of ways in which digital media fought against that anti-democratic sentiment or led to more democratic practice. So I think the jury is still out. And the last two things I'll say is that this is broader than this particular topic, but I have found myself thinking as a largely, but not exclusively, quantitative social scientist, that we need to move beyond thinking about causal relationships and think more about networked relationships, of mutually supportive relationships. I'm kind of over thinking about, does digital media cause X, or does X cause what digital media does? I think there are obviously causal relationships underlying this, but I think if we could come up with ways of thinking about more networked relationships, mutually supportive relationships that lead to the way in which media, citizens, and elites interact with each other, I think that could be fruitful. And then lastly, as academics, as social scientists, we study these things from a, quote, purely academic level at one point, but I think it's increasingly important, as many of you all know, that we be solutions oriented, that when we we're really good at critiquing, we need to get better at what should be done. And I think the project that Jenny is leading has some real potential for doing that. So I'll stop at that point. I could say a lot more, as you can tell, about all of this, but I'll stop at that point. And I look forward to your questions and happy to elucidate on any of what I've just said on the chapter or any other aspect of digital media and democracy that I can speak to. So thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Michael. Before turning to our panelists, I'll add in, Michael mentioned that his broadcast media work is even more relevant today, and I'll just add in some empirical truth to that. That when you look at the impact of his work over time, that there are books from decades ago that have more citations in the past couple of years than they had in the few years that they first came out, which, any academic can be jealous of that. But it speaks to what Michael said toward the end of sort of a broader vision of, I know that a lot of my students have, I know that I have, of wanting the work that we do to have an impact, not only this year, but a couple of years down the road. And I know in this field in particular of digital media, there's a question of, all right, those articles about MySpace, they didn't last for so long in terms of their relevance. But when you think about the broader theoretical themes that Michael pulled out and that we can be researching now as researchers, there's work ahead of us to have an impact in the years and decades to come. I'll note, thank you for those who have already sent some great questions in the chat. Now's your time to add in a few more if you want your questions to be in the round 2 of the questions. And now I'll introduce our 3 panelists from the course who will ask their questions. They're going to ask their questions one after the next, 3 questions in a row, and then Michael will answer them all in a block. So our first panelist to ask her question is Dr. Aya Shoshan, who is a postdoctoral researcher on the ERC project. Aya.
Okay, thank you very much for this really, really interesting talk. I'm currently working with Jenny on a paper that maps the scientific literature on social media and social movements. So we're going to screen share this map, and this map shows recent themes that are prominent in the literature in our findings. And our analysis shows, and this really corresponds to the later part of your talk, that there's been a surge in new research on terms such as fake news, far right, and populism. So this is really kind of what you were talking about. And we were curious if you had thoughts, more thoughts than, you already shared a lot of your thoughts on future research, but is there research directions related to these topics that you think deserve more attention than they are currently getting in the literature?
Thanks. Next, our second question comes from Michal Katz, who is a first-year PhD student in our department. Michal. I think you're on mute. Let's see if we can unmute you.
I'm unmuted.
Okay, go for it.
So a question that came to mind for me is about the role of organizations in shaping democratic futures through digital media. Organizations like nonprofits and political parties. In what ways do you see these different kinds of organizations shaping our democracies?
Okay, great, thanks. And our third question from Maya Shamir, who is a BA MA student and one of the honors tracks in our department. Maya.
Thank you. In this book and in your previous work, you highlighted both the democratic potential and the challenges posed by social media. And I'm thinking, given the rapidly evolving nature of social media platforms and the complexities of politics, what key factors or trend should we be most attentive to in order to ensure that the social media support positive democratic future instead of a negative one?
Excellent. Thank you. So thanks, Aya, Michal, and Maya. And now we'll hear Michael's response to those questions.
Okay, and they're really interrelated in a lot of ways. But in terms of future research, first of all, I have to say that I really like the figure that you showed, because it's a very empirical way of saying, well, what are academics focusing on right now? In that literature, first of all, things are changing so dramatically. I don't know all of that literature. I will admit that right off the bat, but I can tell you the people who are doing work in those areas that you identified that I see as promising. And then maybe I'll say a word or two about what else might be focused on. So on the issue of the far right, and I would actually put that in terms of the larger literature on political polarization. There's someone at Edinburgh, Yif Lelkis, who I think is doing really interesting work in that area. And he has and I should say, this might be useful to you, he has a center called the Political Polarization Lab. And if you go to the website, he has a library of readings on polarization that's pretty comprehensive and real, and he updates it, and he's really up on the literature. So that's a great source for that kind of work. But also work by Jamie Druckmann, I think is really good. Sebastian Valenzuela, I don't know if you know his work, but it's really interesting. Jessica Fizel and Pippa Norris are people that I think about when I think about the focus on ideological extremism, polarization, the far right. The one thing I'd say in that area, I think we have appropriately focused on the rise of the far right. I mentioned it. You all saw that in the literature and the empirical work that you did. I'm not convinced that there's any, and right now there's a lot of work that suggests that there may be something about being conservative that makes that happen. I'm not convinced of that, and I think we could get ahead of the game by also focusing on the far left, because I think that not in any consistent way. I haven't done research on this, but it's my impression that some of the qualities that we saw in the emergence of the far right, including the blurring of entertainment and politics, including the blurring of fact and fiction, disinformation, misinformation, I'm seeing some of that emerge on the left as well. And I think that one area would be to better understand what the relationship between, first of all, ideology, second of all, extremism, and third, digital media, what that relationship is and what's driving it. So I think more research in that area would be interesting. Related to that, in the area of fake news, disinformation, which you saw, I mean, the term fake news, even though it's interesting that you found it so much, my guess is that if you looked at how that term is used in more recent publications, it would be to criticize that term, because there's a more subtle argument going on about the difference between information, disinformation, misinformation. And so, but the work that I've seen, and I'm sure there's much, much more than this, Gordon Pennycook is doing really interesting work in this area. Sander van der Linden is doing interesting work in this area. Natalie Stroud, R. Kelly Garrett, Brendan Nyan, Rasmus Cleese Nielsen has some new work that's really in line with this work. So there's a lot of good work being done in this area. I think the real key thing in terms of going forward, number one is the point I made, which is getting a little bit greater clarity on the various forms of misinformation, fake news, disinformation, misinformation, and also not falling into the trap of assuming that that is only the work of bots and more extremists. That there's a tremendous amount of dis and misinformation taking place in more mainstream media venues that needs to be included in it, and to not see this as an either or kind of proposition. Because I worry that a lot of this research will be fuel for arguments that will ultimately limit the democratic potential of new media in an effort to try to regulate bad speech and misinformation and disinformation. I'd also just kind of throw in as a more general that the work of Homero Gil de Zuniga, I think I'm pronouncing that name close to right, on all these topics with a particular interest on engagement, which I know you all are interested in, and citizen engagement is really good as well. So, and then I would add, in the points that I made earlier, that that doing this it absolutely has to be done in a comparative and global perspective, which is again one of the things I think is great about the project that you all are working on. On organizational, the role of organizations, I mean, the easy answer to that is that absolutely yes. That the balance between kind of a free open market system where everybody's on their own to both identify what's important, to identify how to speak and where to speak. I mean, you need structure. You need structure for this to work in a democratic fashion that's appropriate. And so the types of organizations that you mentioned, nonprofits, political parties, are crucial. No question about it. And the chapters in the Digital Media and Democratic Futures talks about some of the case studies are specifically on the role that nonprofits play. But I would expand what we mean by organizations that are important to this. The major news organizations have been been replaced in terms of political power, or at least matched in political power, by organizations, private sector organizations like Google, like Facebook, like TikTok, like X or Twitter. And so the role that they play, often more to inhibit than enhance democratic engagement, is absolutely important. So I would add them to the list of organizations, broadly speaking. And the one that I really want to emphasize, that I would love to see more research on, and I came to this kind of being pulled yelling and screaming, because I've always not liked the argument that, well, if you're going to solve some of the problems that we see in politics, you need to educate the consumer, you need to educate the citizen. And I agree with that. I always felt in the past, I always felt like, well, that's blaming the victim in a lot of ways, and that we should really be focusing on elites, on organizations. But I do think that since we can't count on elites to do the right thing, and since we live in an increasingly complex information environment, that education is extremely important. And there's an institution that's involved there, and that's, for the sake of this particular argument, though it goes beyond this, higher education. I mean, higher education really needs to be explored as a potential facilitator or inhibitor of the ability of people to act as citizens in a democratically useful way. Higher education can do that in two very different ways. It can do it by the way we hope we do in our political science and communication courses, to teach students to be critical thinkers and critical consumers of the media. But we also train the next generation of leaders and practitioners. So engineering schools need to be thinking about the ethical implications of the work that their students go on and do. Business schools need to be thinking about that. The humanities needs to be thinking about that. And so I think if there's an institution that is somewhat, at least to my knowledge, somewhat understudied, and that could play a really important role in the future of democratic politics and the role of digital media, it's higher education. So I'd emphasize that in particular. And then what are in some ways I've answered the question, what are the factors that can lead to more positive than negative? I think it's a combination of political elites that are committed to this. It's a combination of, hard as it is in a very capitalistic, market-driven society like the US and many other advanced nations, to think about the ethical implications and roles of the work that they do if you're in the business of digital media. And I still hope that a focus on providing two things: as best we can, the facts of politics that are relevant, whether it's environmental change and climate change, or whether it's what's going on with my great concern and sympathy for you all in the Middle East, to what's going on in the Ukraine, to the incredible increase in economic inequality in Western societies, that people have some basic facts around which they can tether their disagreements and opinions. And then secondarily, to create, which digital media has a tremendous capability of doing if done right, to create spaces online where the public can engage across ideological views in robust but civil ways. If there were ways to make that more prevalent, and it is happening, but it's happening behind, less, unfortunately, than the more visible echo chambers and diatribes that we hear and misinformation that we see. But it's there, and it could be expanded. So those would be the foci that I would pay the greatest attention to, I think.
Excellent. Lots of future research to be done here.
Yes, that's the good thing about being in academia. You never finish having work to do. So
yeah, that's great. Good. So we have many really interesting questions that came in the chat. We won't get a chance to ask all of them. The panelists have each selected the one question that most caught their attention, and we won't even really get a chance to hear a full answer to it by the time we need to wrap up. But let's hear the questions that came in any case and see what wisdom Michael has to share with us. And we'll start in the same order. Aya.
Okay, so this question is about regarding the stolen elections in 2020. You said that it's based on digital media representation that's more important than the underlying facts. How can we minimize the negative influence of the media on democratic participation, considering the fact that the media has such great authority of how people think and view reality?
Great, thanks. And next question from Michal.
Well, this is another organizational question. What kind of digital work do you think global organizations like the UN or The Hague can do to encourage and progress state solutions in the Middle East, and especially amongst the people in the Middle East, not just convincing people in America that we need something different here?
Michal added the nice question, can we rely on Twitter to bring peace in the Middle East? Next to Maya, your question.
So today, in the age where we have post messages that replacing news articles, and Twitter limiting the characters that you can write, and the emergence now of shorts video in YouTube and in TikTok, all of these are people that are trying to convey very complex political issues in only seconds. And therefore, we're seeing oversimplifying of reality. Do you think that we, in a certain way, moved past the point of no return when it comes to the public ability to have a fruitful and complex political discourse?
Okay, thanks. So we will want to wrap up by past, so we'll see how much wisdom Michael can
Okay,
shoot
well, I'm
into
going to
our brains
mostly
in the next
show
couple of
my,
minutes.
first of all, they're great questions. And second
Yeah.
of all, I'll just say right off the bat, I do not know the answers to these questions, but I will give you my thoughts on them. So the stolen elections in 2020 and what can we do? So a couple of thoughts about that. If you are what we call in the book that I wrote with Bruce, a media grazer, if you do not limit yourself to to one source of information, and this does not require spending your full day doing this. This is truly grazing, an hour or so. You can find the arguments that and the evidence. Although there's always trust involved in this, you have to believe the source of the evidence. But if you believe the source and you look and you compare sources, the facts are out there. And so why then does the belief among, in the Iowa caucuses, I don't know how much of what you all know about the U.S. political system, but the first set of caucuses, not primary, but a caucus where people get together to talk about who they support, in the state of Iowa just took place 2 days ago. And in the exit polls that were done, 2/3 of the people who went to those caucuses to decide who they were going to support for presidential candidate for the Republican Party said that they believe the 2020 election was stolen. Now, I'm starting from the premise that it was not stolen, and I am basing that on what I think is empirical evidence, though in the end, I trust the sources that tell me that that there was not, because I didn't do the research myself for that. But there's good reason to believe it was not stolen in any meaningful way, and yet that many people believe it, and about 1/3 of the public more generally believes that. So why is that the case? Number one, I would say that the areas to look at is I think the more mainstream media or legacy media has really made a serious effort to always mention, even if they're covering people who say that it was stolen, that it was not stolen, and the evidence makes clear that it was not stolen. one thing is we have political elites, both in the media, like Fox News, and in the Republican Party, and in other kind of celebrity elites and political leading figures who say and tell their constituencies that it was stolen. And so if they trust them more than they trust the media, then they're going to believe that it was stolen. And you sprinkle into that the ability to use some of the short forms that was mentioned with the last question of videos that have been doctored and statements that are completely untrue and evidence that's completely untrue. You can create a setting in which misinformation winds up carrying the day, even when people have access to true information. So in answer to what do you do to prevent that, either here or in what's going on in the Middle East, I don't know. I am worried that, because the other area that I've done a lot of research in has been on the importance of factual information. I'm worried that I'm wrong about that. That the assumption of all that work that I did in that area is that once people have facts, it moderates their views in a way that brings it closer to matching what their own interests are and what the public interest is. I'm worried that that may not be true anymore, that we may have at least a large segment of the society for whom facts simply actively do not matter. And if that's true, the game is off. And so I'm allowed to have this feeling because I'm older, but I am quite concerned about whether democracy can work, if I put it in its most extreme form of the way I feel sometimes. I resist that feeling, but I do not have an answer to what we do to improve that, if even in the face of having enough media that can tell you what is as best we know the truth, if people can either avoid it or listen to it and twist it or listen to it and ignore it, the game is off. And so I don't know what to do about that. Apologies. What can global organizations do? I think they can continue increasingly the audiences for the major issues of the day, whether it's climate change or what's going on in the Middle East or immigration patterns, is a global issue. And so all I can say is that global organizations, I think, need to at least become the curators of information, if not the producers of information, that we have reason to think can be useful in citizens making decisions, and then hope that I'm wrong about what I said a moment ago about maybe facts just don't matter to enough people anymore. I want to say that there are certain kinds of short form media that I think can be powerfully effective. I teach at University of Pennsylvania, but you may or may not know who Benjamin Franklin is. But Benjamin Franklin wrote a series of aphorisms that still hold true today, and they're valuable. So it's not just the length, but it is an issue with the length. That once the short form video, short form writing can be helpful, but all it's helpful at is to get you to think about things. You still need to try to delve deeper, to have a curious enough mind that if you read something or watch something that you're suspicious of or think that's interesting or want to know more about it, to do that extra legwork. And we live in a world now where you can do that at the touch of a mouse button. But it requires work. And that brings me back to the importance of the role of the citizen and the role of education in all of this. But I do think, again, just to stay consistent on my themes, I actually think there's a lot of long form, valuable long form journalism, narrative, entertainment media that can be incredibly educational. It's just that in the political world, we tend to focus too much on just the short form versions of this. So I apologize for not having good answers for you on all of this, but these are all, I think, the important questions going forward. And I think we are at a real turning point where we'll see whether democracy can, in the end, whether it can effectively address the underlying issues. Because if it can't effectively address the issues that people are concerned about, then I can understand why people are willing to turn away from it.
Thank you, Michael. And this tough question that you asked at the end, can democracy work? I want to loop back around to the part where you listed, I don't know, at least a dozen names of researchers that we know who are doing a lot of hopeful, forward-thinking work because that question is so important. So thanks for bringing those themes together here. So thanks to Michael, thanks to all of our panelists for leading this first webinar in our series, and to our participants for asking such great questions. We're going to hold on to them for our future classes. And we look forward to seeing you all again in our upcoming webinars. We have one on February 21st with Professor Noam Lupu from Vanderbilt University, and on March 6th with Professor Theda Skocpol from Harvard University. So see you then. Thanks for joining.
Thank you.